Chapter 12 of The Duck-Footed Hound by Jim KJELGAARD. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Harky's Plot. Melly Garson, still immobilized by the mule kick, was aware of the stain that afflicted his immortal soul. But he was not completely repentant. Nothing could be worse than another day on the pickle keg. Listlessly, Melly caught up a handful of pebbles and shied them one by one at a knothole in the woodshed wall. He shook his head and uttered a despairing moan. Tossing pebbles at the knothole was the only game he'd invented to beguile the passing hours. And at first it had been interesting, because he made a bullseye only about 1 time in 20. Now it seemed that every pebble he tossed sailed through the knothole as naturally as a trout swims up riffles. Melly contemplated scooping up more pebbles for more sharpshooting, but where was the fun when he just couldn't miss? Glumly, he reviewed the sin for which he must one day answer. He should not, he told himself, ever have sent Melinda to take Glory on the coon hunt. But how was he to know that they'd get old Joe up in his magic sycamore? Could he possibly have had forewarning of the fact that Melinda would not only question the witchery of old Joe and his magic tree, but infect the minds of her male companions with her own skepticism? Could anyone guess that the hollow traditions of the Creeping Hills coon hunters would topple simply because a girl took part in a coon hunt? Melly shook his head sadly. Melinda, not exactly a woman, was not exactly a girl either. She was, Melly told himself, old enough to cast the monkey wrench that usually lands in the gears whenever women intrude on affairs that by every law of God and nature belong exclusively to men. The wreckage had been fearful indeed. Mun Mundy laid up with a broken leg, Ross Stanfield and Butt Johnson afraid to show their faces on the lower reaches of Willow Brook, Harky Mundy mad as a trapped mink, and Melinda explaining blithely that hunting raccoons was indeed good sport. Melly buried his face in his hands and shook with anguish. He was not, he told himself honestly, as ashamed as he should be because he had thrown such a destructive bomb among the Creeping Hills coon hunters. But that a Garson, even a female Garson, should refer to the art of coon hunting as mere good sport shook the very foundations of everything in which Melly had faith. Glory, who had been dozing in the sun, rose and prowled restlessly over to snuffle at a woodpile. Melly regarded her with an experienced eye. Melinda might lack a true appreciation of coon hunting, but she'd certainly given him a thorough rundown on Glory. A slow starter and slow hunter, Melinda had said, and she tongued on the trail, but she was steady as a church and true as a homing pigeon. She was every bit as good as Queenie, and with a little of experience she'd be better. A year from now, any coon Glory got on would be treed or run to earth. Melly had a sudden uncomfortable feeling that he himself would not have found out so much about Glory in just one hunt. Or, if he had, he'd be inclined to doubt until Glory proved herself. But he'd accepted Melinda's evaluation without the slightest question. And now, as he looked at Glory, he knew a rising uneasiness. A good thing was never to be taken for granted, and there was much that could happen to any hunting hound. Melly had only to remember Precious Sue. Though he fervently hoped she wouldn't, Glory might go the same way, and where would he find another coonhound of equal quality? There was only one source. However, there was a great deal involved. It was blasphemy even to think in terms of ordinary coon dogs when Glory was simultaneously in mind. There were only 2 hounds on Willow Brook worthy of her, Thunder and Duckfoot. Things being as they were, even if all else were equal, it was unlikely that Butt Johnson would bring either his hound or himself within 9 miles of the Garsons, or anything that belonged to the Garsons. About to catch up another handful of pebbles, Melly grimaced and refrained. He did not know how many pebbles he'd flicked from the upended pickle keg through the knothole and into the woodshed, but offhand he guessed there were at least 4 bushels, and he didn't want to even think about another one. Nor had he much of anything else to occupy his thoughts. His daughters, with a minimum of fuss and a maximum of efficiency, had all the farm tasks well in hand. Melly resumed his study of Glory, who had lain down in the sun but was not sleeping, and wondered if he should keep her tied up. She might go wandering, and there was no assurance that she'd be as lucky as Precious Sue. As everyone knew, the woods were just filled with all sorts of witches, and many of them were all bad. Glumly Melly pondered the probability that she'd break loose and go wandering even if he tied her. Would anything ever go right for him? when Glory sat up, tilted her head, and voiced a small warning wail. A moment later, Harky Mundy appeared. Melly sat still, doing his best to conceal his amazement, for he'd have been no more completely astounded if old Joe himself had appeared with the ghost of Precious Sue in hot pursuit. Obviously, Harky was not seeking a fight, for he carried no fighting tools, but he certainly was not coming in peace. After Melly's foul trick, the Mundys would never make peace with the Garsons. On the point of demanding that Harky state his business and be on his way, Harky forestalled him with, "I come to ask, can Melinda fetch Glory on another coon hunt tonight?" For a moment, Melly felt as though he'd been again mule-kicked. This time squarely between the eyes. He blinked and recovered. "I thought," he heard himself saying, "that you come to ask, can Melinda fetch Glory on another coon hunt tonight?" "I did," Harky asserted. A sudden suspicion prickled Melly's mind. Boys were boys and girls were girls, and all things considered, it was a very pleasing arrangement, and there was no harm whatever in a bit of smooching. But how come Harky Mundy, otherwise so very sensible, thought he could successfully blend that with a coon hunt? Or did he? "You got notions about that girl child of mine?" he demanded. "You bet," Harky assured him. "Well, I don't know as I have any real objections. Melinda's a mite young. You're a mite young yourself to be hunting a wife." "Wife?" Harky gasped. "You think I've been moonstruck?" "You talk like you been," Melly growled. "A man has to before he'll let himself in for all that can happen when he asks a woman to go coon hunting. Who you aim to take along outside of Melinda and Glory?" "Me and Duck-Foot," Harky stated. "But you ain't got no ideas about Melinda," Melly pursued. "You're darn whistling right I got ideas," Harky said. "I've had 'em ever since the night everything's got smashed to bits." "I know," Melly said gloomily. "I can't even take no pleasure on account Pa can't make me fetch the corn and husk it," Harky continued. "I know," said Melly, and he shrugged helplessly. "Many's the time I've been tempted to leave mine out. With 14 women folk, a body's got less chance than you stand with your Pa." "Could be you're right," Harky said reflectively. "I guess there's times when a man like you just can't help himself, and that's why you sent Melinda on the coon hunt." "I could have helped myself," Melly corrected. "I could have told Melinda to stay home, and she'd stayed. But I didn't, and she didn't." "Why do you send her?" Harky asked. "Pure devilishness," said Melly. "I was mule-kicked, and couldn't go coon hunting, so I figured I'd ruin it for everybody else." "You sure enough did," Harky told him. "Pa's got a busted leg, Ra and Butt are staying near enough the woods so they can duck into 'em, and us coon hunters are just gonna sink right where we are without we doing something." "What do you aim to do, Harky?" "I gotta take Melinda out, and I'll bring her back. We have to run old Joe up his big sycamore, and I gotta show Melinda that there ain't any den there for him to hide in." "It's a right big order," Melly said. "But the only chance any of us got," Harky pointed out. "That Miss Cathby, she come into the hills and tried to teach that old Joe ain't nothing but a big old coon. The rest, she says, is a lot of foolishness too. If we don't put a finish to that sort of thing once and for all, even us men will be sitting around gathering our lore out of books instead of coon hunts." Melly shuddered at the prospect so horrible. There was a brief silence, and Harky asked, "Can Melinda fetch Glory tonight?" Melly said seriously, "Maybe you ain't been moonstruck in one way, but you sure haven't been in the other. You ever tried telling a woman what to do?" "No," Harky conceded, "but I'd like to." "Me too," Melly said sadly. "But I know better. Melinda can go if she wants to, and I kind of think she will on account she likes coon hunting. But—" "But what?" Harky asked. "But none," Melly said. About to fill Harky's understanding ear with his recent mental turmoil, and how that was responsible for his decision to keep Glory tied, Melly wisely said nothing. Somehow or other, he'd got just what he wanted anyhow, and Glory would be running with Duck-Foot. Only fools meddled with affairs that were already perfect. "Good enough," said Harky. "I'll wait till Melinda comes." In due course, another day at Miss Cathby's school behind them, Melinda and Mary danced into the yard. Mary, who not only thought Harky a roughneck, but said so loudly, frequently, and publicly, stuck her tongue out at him and ran into the house. Melinda, met and accompanied by an ecstatic Glory, came to where her father and Harky waited. "You must have your corn in, Harold," she said sweetly. "How come you ask that?" Harky demanded. "If you didn't, you'd never be wasting daylight hours just talking." "Corn ain't in, and it ain't gonna be," Harky stated. "It ain't none of your mix if it is or not. What I come to ask is, will you bring Glory and come hunting tonight?" "Can I, Pa?" Melinda breathed. "If you've a mind to," Melly said. "Oh, Pa!" She kissed him, assured Harky that she would be there with Glory at nightfall, and ran into the house. Melly turned glowing eyes on Harky. "You do get yourself a wife come 2-3 years. Don't cuss your girl children. Did you see her kiss me?" "Faugh," said Harky. Duck-Foot, sitting on the Mundy porch, was hopefully sniffling the pork chops Harky was frying inside, knowing that in the fullness of time he would be gnawing the bones. Duck-Foot licked his pendulous jowls in happy anticipation and blew through his nose. If he ever thought of himself at all, which he seldom did, it was never to wonder what he was or why he had been created. He was a hound. He had been created to hunt coons, and that's all Duck-Foot had to know. He could not possibly understand that he was a canine genius, and he wouldn't have cared if he had. The blood of Precious Sue mingled with that of Rafe Bradley's huge hound in Duck-Foot, and he had inherited the best of both plus something more. He was born with a sense of smell and an ability to stick to a trail that is rare in even the best of experienced hounds. The extra something consisted of the talent to outthink and outguess the quarry he was running. He'd been a mere pup the night Old Joe came raiding, but he'd experienced little difficulty in tracking Old Joe to his magic sycamore, and he'd learned since. The second time they ran Old Joe, Duck-Foot had paced the renowned Thunder and arrived at the sycamore with his far more experienced hunting companion. He'd known perfectly well that Old Joe was in the den, for he could smell him up there. With the coon up, and for as long as the coon remained up, Duck-Foot was satisfied to run true to form and bay at the tree. Sooner or later his master would hear him tonguing and arrive to take charge. But Duck-Foot had no intention of letting any coon, treed or not, get the upper hand, and he had called on his inborn hunting sense to make sure they never did. Even Thunder considered his whole duty discharged if he either caught his coon on the ground or treed him in the bayed tree. Duck-Foot went beyond that to complete grasp of any given situation. He had known even as he supported Thunder's voice with his own, that Old Joe might try to escape, and that the one logical escape route was further up the sycamore and into the tunnel. The instant Old Joe left his den, Duck-Foot raced for the ledge. Only the cramped tunnel prevented him from overtaking Joe, and there had been a long, hard chase after the big coon emerged into the swamp. Old Joe had finally escaped by entering a beaver pond, diving, evicting the rightful tenants of their domed house, and waiting it out. It was a maneuver that Duck-Foot had yet to learn. All he was sure of was that the beaver appeared but the coon had disappeared. Duck-Foot, however, had learned exactly what to do should Old Joe again enter his den in the sycamore and be forced out of it. Rather than go to the tunnel's entrance, he'd go to its mouth and wait for his quarry to come out. Thus Old Joe entered a wrong phase of his own special moon. If he'd treed in the sycamore and stayed there, his den would surely be discovered. If he left, Duck-Foot would catch him in the swamp. 2 seconds before his supper was ready, Duck-Foot winded Old Joe. The old raider was down in the corn, making ready to rip a shock apart and help himself to the ears when Duck-Foot rushed. With a coon scented, he forgot even the prospect of pork chop bones. The trail led to Willow Brook. Ranging upstream, Duck-Foot found where the big coon had emerged on the far bank and tried to lose his scent in the slough. Duck-Foot solved that one. Running like a greyhound when he was on his scent and working methodically when he was not, he went on. Presently, far behind, he heard Glory begin to tongue. Duck-Foot set himself to working out another twist in Old Joe's trail. Beyond any doubt, it would lead to the magic sycamore. End of chapter 12.